Good afternoon, fans. This is the Environmental Echo by PW Grosser, and I'm your host, Paul Boyce, CEO and president of the firm. And I just want to say thanks for listening. We do have a great topic and a great guest today on our podcast. We have got Professor or Dr. Chris Gobler from the University of Stony Brook, and we're going to be talking about some real interesting stuff as it relates to the environment and nitrogen and surface and groundwaters. But before we begin, I just want to say that the best way to get a hold of us, if anyone's interested in following up with questions, comments, or thoughts and ideas, is through our website, which is www.pwgrosser.com/podcast. We're usually very responsive with that stuff. We've got guys that check it every single day. So again, comments, best way to get a hold of us is right on in. So let me introduce our guest. As I mentioned, it's going to be Dr. Chris Gobler from the University of Stony Brook. Chris, welcome, and thanks for joining us. Just a little bit about his background. After we've just wanted to say we did take a summer break this year, so we did skip a couple of months, and we're glad to be back on the air and live here. But our guest, he is the head of the University of Stony Brook's School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. That's SOMAS. He received his master's and PhD from SUNY Stony Brook in the 1990s, and Dr. Gobler began his academic career at Long Island University in 1999. In 2005, he joined Stony Brook University as the Director of Academic Programs for SOMAS at Stony Brook's Southampton campus. In 2014, he was appointed as the Associate Dean of Research at SOMAS, and in 2015, he was named co-director for the Center for Clean Water Technology, or CCWT, which is investigating how anthropogenic activities such as climate change, eutrophication, and the overharvesting of fisheries alters the natural biochemical and ecological functioning of coastal ecosystems. He studied the impacts of harmful algal blooms caused by multiple classes of phytoplankton in diverse ecosystems and the effects of coastal ocean acidification on marine life. I mean, this is all, you'll see. I'm an avid surfer, so I love the ocean. It's going to be an interesting topic here. A lifelong Long Islander, his focus on marine sciences was motivated by the progressive declines in Long Island's shell fisheries during the 1980s. Over the past 20 years, his research has identified the key role of excessive nitrogen has played in the degradation of Long Island's fisheries and water quality. With the establishment of the CCWT, Dr. Gobler sees the promise of discovering the solutions to Long Island's nitrogen problems and the creation of an industry that creates jobs for Long Islanders. And Chris, thanks for coming on and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
All right, so let's get started. As I've mentioned, PW Grosser, we are an environmental engineering and consulting firm, and this is what we love to do. Our vision, or actually our mission, is to help clean up the planet for our clients and make this a more sustainable place for the current and future generations. But with our guest today, over the past decade, much of the focus has been on the design and engineering of wastewater treatment systems, that are aimed at reducing nitrogen levels and loading. We can't open a paper or look at the news without seeing a story that's related to this type of stuff, the impacts of nitrogen has on our either surface waters or groundwaters. For our viewers and our listeners, can you tell us about the negative influence nitrogen is having on our ground and surface waters?
Sure thing. Yeah. And let me just say, happy to be here and talking to you. But yeah, actually, interestingly, just a year after I was born in 1971, a very famous scientist from Woods Hole Oceanographic, which is the nation's most renowned and oceanographic institute in the country, published a paper in the journal Science, the top science journal. And it was 1971, he recognized that in New York coastal waters that nitrogen was what he called the limiting element. And essentially what that means is that nitrogen controls the rate at which primary production proceeds in New York coastal waters. And so when you add a little bit of nitrogen to the water, therefore, it has a big impact on the ecosystem. It triggers a cascade of events where it's going to make primary producers like phytoplankton and algae grow faster, and that can be seaweeds, that can be phytoplankton, and it can have negative impacts on other things like salt marshes and then seagrasses. And amongst the microalgae, the phytoplankton, sometimes, in many cases, the phytoplankton that grow can be harmful. Some of these things called harmful algal blooms. Those types of algae can be harmful to humans because in some cases they make toxins. In other cases, they're harmless to humans, but they can cause things like fish kills. They can be something called ichthyotoxic. So you can get the overgrowth of these harmful algal blooms with too much nitrogen. And like I said, that can make people sick. That can lead to fish kills. That can lead to low oxygen. It definitely leads to shading. That shading, of course, can kill off and has killed off seagrasses. The low oxygen is detrimental, harmful to marine life. Nothing except for bacteria can live without oxygen. So you get this whole cascading event, series of events, and it's essentially what's happened since Ryder published that paper in the 70s. And so that is, we have progressively more and more people, and therefore more and more nitrogen from wastewater. And in Suffolk County, of course, with 70% of the homes being built not being connected to a sewage treatment plant, household wastewater is going right to groundwater and therefore becomes our drinking water source. And what we don't extract discharges into surface waters and initiates this cascade of events. And, as a consequence, hard clam landings on the South Shore are down 99%. The scallop fishery on the east end similarly down 99%. So anyway, that sort of gives you the broad overview of why nitrogen is so central in controlling things.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a topic we've had on the podcast before, and it is important. And you started to mention some of the sources of excess nitrogen, like the sanitary systems. Are there any other sources besides just wastewater that we should be concerned about?
Sure. Wastewater is really the primary one or the most important one, right? So the studies have been done, and it's not surprising that that's the case because usually unless you're living in a very very rural area, the biggest source is either going to be wastewater or fertilizer. And because we're so densely populated on Long Island, just as a caveat, or not a caveat, but a side note that the density of people living in Nassau and Suffolk County, if we were a nation, we'd be something like the 20th most densely populated country in the world. And so when you have that many people that densely populated, it's almost impossible for wastewater to not be the biggest source of nitrogen. But we do know that fertilizer can also be important. It's usually, and in almost all cases, it's the second biggest contributor. And whether that fertilizer is coming from residential use or golf courses or agriculture, of course, all depends on where you are across Long Island.
Well, it's a significant issue for us. We've seen that play out, and you've mentioned stuff like the harmful algal blooms, the HABs, right? The blue-green algae, the brown or the rust tides, the things like that. How significant is it really in the formation of those occurrences, and what other factors are contributing to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly central. We've published the paper showing if you add more nitrogen to the water, these harmful algal blooms grow faster, they get more dense. And one of the really troubling parts is that they actually, in at least two cases, get more toxic. That is, the toxins that they make are nitrogen rich compounds. And I'll just call it out. There's one called saxitoxin. That's a neurotoxin. It's 1,000 times more potent than cyanide. That's made by a marine HAB. And in the freshwater realm, there's microcystin, which is a gastrointestinal toxin, also very nitrogen rich. When it was first identified, the scientists called it fast death factor because it's so potent. And again, in both cases, more nitrogen allows the HABs to make more toxins. So it's a very very central controlling factor in these events. There's other things that also can contribute in time and place. We could talk about that. Things like climate change factors and such.
Oh, that was my next question. Temperature. Right? That's got to play a big role in this stuff. As I mentioned, I'm an avid surfer, and this was the warmest I've ever felt the ocean in my 30 plus years of surfing. It's what's going on. I'm sure that's got to be contributing.
Yeah. Well, our lab group actually pioneered the use of using satellite-based temperature to historically reconstruct changes in coastal water temperature actually globally, because it's based on satellites that go all across the globe.
Yeah.
So we publish papers that look at everything from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. But of course, we've also, with that data set, been able to do a deep dive in Long Island, and you know your feet are not deceiving you as you sit at your surfboard and feel those temperatures, and that the the warming that we've experienced this century alone, so since the turn of the century, since about the year 2000 until now, um, has been 4 times the global average. So we're I won't say we're the epicenter for global warming, but we're one of those regions on the planet that are warming faster than average.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the interesting thing, right? When people talk about global climate change, by virtue of that word global, what it often their meaning is the global average, which is meaningless because really, what's important is what's happening in each individual ecosystem. And there are ecosystems that are cooling, but ours is one that's warming fast. What I didn't say, and it's important to emphasize, this is specifically in summer, right? So some of our other seasons, like spring, for example, haven't really changed that much, but our summers are much warmer. Technically, that's probably the worst time for it to happen, however, right? Because if you warm in the spring, all that simply does is it shifts the seasons, right? So you'll just move through spring quickly and you'll get the summer faster when it comes to sort of the succession of animals and plants that you'll have in the water. Um, but when it happens in summer, essentially what that means is you're hitting a whole new territory. And as you hit that new territory, there's essentially two outcomes. Some things in the water are going to be pushed beyond their maximal thermal tolerance, and I don't know how else to say it. They're going to tap out. But there'll be other organisms that say, "Oh, look, this is perfect," and they're going to come in and really enjoy things. And so, just to give some examples, the Long Island lobster used to be a huge fishery. The Long Island Sound lobster was actually the biggest fishery in New York at the end of the 20th century. It totally collapsed at the turn of the century, so in the year 1999, and never returned. But Maine, actually, that fishery, because it got warmer into the ideal range, has been doing great. But other organisms are threatened now by higher temperatures. For example, the Peconic bay scallop is now at its sort of its thermal maximum, and it is that fishery's recently declared a federal disaster, one of I think 3 or 4 in the whole country for the last several years, and it affects the harmful algal blooms because there's at least one species, for example, the Russ tide. We never saw that in the 20th century. It now happens every year, and it's simply because we weren't we in the 20th century. It had a very brief window for it to form what we'd call a bloom, but now that window encompasses almost the whole summer, so it's right in its sweet spot. And and as a consequence, the Russ tides on Long Island started in early July, and they're still going on. As if I got a report of one just yesterday.
Oh gosh, yeah. And for me, I firsthand experience. Obviously, I love the water, love to go out fishing, love boating and all that stuff. And we're out there in the Great South Bay in some spots, and it looks like we're cruising across like coffee. I mean, like it's that brown. It's frightening. But you mentioned you're born in the 1970s. We're almost probably the exact same age here. I was born in the early 70s as well. But I remember back in the 80s when I was a teenager. You mentioned the clams, the hard in your bio. We mentioned the clams and the hard shell fisheries and everything else. And I've had family members and friends that were all into clamming back then. Yep. And I'd go down to the dock at the end of the day when they were all coming in, and they're just coming in with bushels, and there was more boats than I could count. It was amazing. Mm-hmm. And now I'm out there. If I see 1 or 2 of them on the bay, I'm surprised. So it's interesting, and it's upsetting. Especially on the East End, there was once a thriving scallop industry out there as well. That's a shadow of itself. How did we get there? What do we do to ourselves?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a consequence of multiple factors concurrently. So, on the South Shore, what you were witnessing at that point in time with the gangbuster harvest was actually the mismanagement of a fishery, and that is they're letting anybody who wanted to clam, which is, that was great. And it created this great maritime tradition. But the history of fisheries across the world is, oh, a fishery's really good, everybody jumps in, everybody's harvesting, and then, oh my gosh, the fishery's gone, right? And so, and so the lesson learned through the 20th century is that you've got to, fisheries have to be managed. So anyway, boiling it down, that hard clam fishery, when it first collapsed, and that, the decline started in the early 80s. That first collapse was actually due to overharvesting. So you saw it, right? When you
Yeah.
when you have that many boats pulling in that many clams day after day after day, eventually it's going to pull everything out. And that's what happened. But at the same time, without those clams there and the loading of nitrogen increasing, that made that ecosystem vulnerable to these harmful algal blooms, which then prevented the clams from recovering. And I'll just mention also that the clams in the former state, when there were lots of them, were part of keeping water quality in check. Right? Clams are what we call filter feeding bivalves. They filter the water. Right? So they're no different than, technically, than the filter you put on a fish tank or on a pool. Right? They
Yep.
filter
Yep.
the water and they keep it clear. You remove that filter, and lo and behold, the water starts to get murky. And we don't have in the 70s. It's estimated that there were enough clams to filter the whole bay every 3 days. Now we think it takes more than 3 months, and so
God.
you lose the filter, and then you add the nitrogen, and that's how we land where we are today.
Oh, geez. And I assume the same thing for the scallops. I mean, because I've just seen the last couple of, I don't know, summers. It's just non-existent anymore. They're gone.
It's similar to the scallops, except that it wasn't the overharvest that did in that fishery. It was in the first iteration of brown tide, so a harmful algal bloom in 1985, that dealt the first blow to that fishery. There was a lot of restoration efforts made, and it was recovering to some extent earlier this century. So let's say 2005 through 2015. But since then, there's been the temperatures warming. So like I said, even though that recovery started, and then we got to the point where, almost every summer we measure temperatures in the Peconic estuary, and we're routinely measuring temperatures that are in the mid 80s, which is, this is water, it's not air,
Yeah.
so it gets really warm. And on top of that, there's been other problems. Rust tides, as I just mentioned, have been happening year after year. You throw in some disease like a parasite that might be in there, and it's tough for the scallops as well.
I've heard about the parasites, but to move to maybe a little bit of a different topic, Superstorm Sandy. That opened a breach, right? That old inlet out there by kind of like Bellport, sort of a little bit west of Smith's Point there.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's closed yet. I know it was starting to close up, but what?
Definitely, it has closed. We actually have one obviously hard to monitor because it's in what they call the wilderness, right? So you can't drive there. The only way to get there is by boat. But between boat visits and aerials, it definitely did close earlier this year, and we've had actually a gauge in Bellport Bay, a continuous water quality monitoring device. Actually, anybody can go visit it from my lab webpage in Bellport, and so with that, we've gotten a sense of how the breach is doing via the salinity monitoring. So it's closed, but it does. You do get ocean washover and significant ocean washover now and again. So, for example, when we had, I guess when Hurricane Lee passed by, it was the storms, or the storm surge and the waves from all that. I could actually see that there was some washover, and that the salinity popped way up. So a lot of water waves breaking over, bringing in that ocean water, and then since then it's been sort of tailing down again. So
is this a good thing when the breach is open? I mean, everything I've seen and read, it's things were starting to come back, things were getting cleaned up. I mean, is this something we need to think about?
Well, I mean, I'll give a yes and no answer. On the yes side, there's no doubt that inlet formed. Bellport Bay got a lot cleaner, and could be because you simply had more tidal flushing. Same thing happened for Narrow Bay, which is right next to Bellport Bay.
Hmm.
Because when that breach formed, I think I even said on record, "Oh, this is going to solve all Great South Bay's problems," and because my assumption is that it would flush out the whole bay. But the interesting thing about inlets is that they don't, and tidal flushing in general in physics, it's going to do it's they're going to we're not in control, right? And we can't even necessarily predict the outcomes. You can try to model them, but it doesn't always work. And so that new inlet ended up communicating very well with the Mauritius Inlet, but had almost no flow to the west. And so what it actually did is there was a great, like I said, so we published a paper on this in 2019, that there was significant water quality improvement in Bellport Bay and in Narrow Bay. But actually in central Great South Bay, the water quality got a little bit worse. And that's because what you ended up getting is the Fire Island Inlet flushing well with the Jones Inlet, that new inlet flushing well with the Mauritius Inlet, and then the middle of Great South Bay sort of, to some extent, sloshing back and forth. Yeah, there were more brown tides, for example, during the post-breach time period. So I think it was like 2013 to 2018 that we measured in that paper, compared to before. So there's no doubt ocean flushing is a good thing, and there's the old adage, dilution is the solution to pollution.
Oh yeah.
And and these are truisms, but the other truism is that we just can't. If you get enhanced flushing in one region, don't presume you know how the rest of the ecosystem is going to respond, and it may well result in a more stagnant area. So
That's Chris. That was super interesting because I heard about how it cleaned up, by the inlets and everything. But in between them, like you just mentioned, I had no idea that was happening. That got stagnant and things actually degraded a little bit. So that's something to think about because I've spoken to some politicians and some other engineers, and people think, well, what if we put a series of pipes under the barrier island and we pump water back and forth? Is this going to help? And it's a matter of maybe where you do it and how much. But
and there's been there was, as an example on that topic, the state invested through the town of Southampton a big study to look at that, like, oh, let's put some pipes in Shinnecock Bay that should help flush things out. And the interesting thing is that it had an effect, but it was very small. And the improvement in water quality, I can't remember, but it was something like maybe 3% of the bay would flush at a faster rate. And it also, you have to think of the other potential consequences. So just as one consequence we thought about in that case, I've headed a program called the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Project, where we've planted a lot of hard clams in Shinnecock Bay. And the idea is we were planting adults, not little seed, because the adults can spawn and make more clams. And, an individual, 2 clams together can make tens of millions of clams in a single spawning event. And so that actually worked very, very well. And so that clam fishery is actually on an upward trajectory. But the important point is that when clams reproduce, it's called broadcast spawning. They throw their gametes in the water. The baby clams are in the water. And for the fishery to make a comeback, those larvae have to stay in the bay for a couple of weeks because they're swimming around the larval phase for 2 weeks, right? And so when we planted the clams, we said, oh, we'll put them here because that'll keep them in the bay. Well, if you suddenly, punch a hole in there, what we found is that the ones that you put by an inlet get washed out to the ocean, and you'll never see them again.
All really interesting stuff. All right, I want to thank everyone today for listening. That was the first half of a 2-part podcast, and please stay tuned for part 2, which is coming up soon.